A teacher humiliates a girl in the classroom, but he never expected what was about to happen after that moment. Sophie's worn shoes scuffed against the cracked sidewalk as she hurried towards Oakwood Elementary, her threadbare backpack bouncing against her spine. At 9 years old, she carried more than just her meager school supplies. She bore the weight of dreams far too heavy for her small shoulders. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Sophie had risen, helping her grandfather, Edward, prepare for another day of selling newspapers on the bustling street corners of their rundown neighborhood. His weathered hands, marked by decades of hard labor, had gently smoothed her tangled hair before sending her off to school with a kiss on her forehead and a promise of a better tomorrow. As Sophie approached the imposing brick building of Oakwood Elementary, her heart raced. She paused at the bottom of the steps, taking a deep breath to steel herself against what lay ahead. The jeers and taunts of her classmates echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of the invisible barrier that separated her from the other children. With trembling fingers, Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. On it, in her grandfather's shaky handwriting, were the words that had become her daily mantra. "You are smart, you are strong, you are loved." She pressed the paper to her lips, drawing strength from the love infused in every carefully penned letter. As she climbed the steps, the world around her seemed to fade away. The laughter of carefree children, the honking of impatient drivers, and the general bustle of the morning rush all melted into a distant hum. In that moment, Sophie made a silent vow to herself and to her grandfather. She would rise above the circumstances that threatened to define her. She would prove to the world, and more importantly to herself, that she was more than just the newspaper girl. With one final deep breath, Sophie pushed open the heavy doors of Oakwood Elementary. The cool air of the hallway washed over her, carrying with it the scent of chalk dust and floor polish. As she stepped inside, the cacophony of voices and slamming lockers enveloped her, marking the beginning of another day in a world that seemed determined to push her down. But Sophie Lynn was not one to be pushed down easily. With her chin held high and her grandfather's words echoing in her heart, she walked into the classroom, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did she know that this ordinary Tuesday would become the day that would change her life forever. The classroom buzzed with the usual morning chatter as Sophie slipped into her seat at the back of the room. She kept her head down, hoping to avoid drawing attention to herself, but her hopes were quickly dashed. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence," sneered Brittany, the class queen bee, her designer shoes tapping impatiently against the linoleum floor. "I thought you'd dropped out to join the circus or something." Sophie's cheeks burned, but she remained silent, focusing instead on arranging her worn pencils and tattered notebook on her desk. She'd learned long ago that engaging with Brittany only made things worse. As the final bell rang, Mr. Thompson strode into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The balding math teacher's eyes narrowed as they landed on Sophie. "Ms. Lynn," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "so kind of you to join us. I trust you weren't too busy collecting cans on the roadside this morning?" The class erupted in laughter, and Sophie felt her throat tighten. She'd arrived on time, just like every other day, but Mr. Thompson seemed determined to single her out. "No, sir," she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was helping my grandfather with—" "Spare us the sob story," Mr. Thompson interrupted, turning to the blackboard. "Now let's see if you can keep up with today's lesson, shall we?" As Mr. Thompson began scrawling complex equations across the board, Sophie's mind raced. Despite the gnawing hunger in her stomach and the emotional weight pressing down on her, she found solace in the elegant dance of numbers and symbols. Math had always been her sanctuary, a world where poverty and social status held no sway. While her classmates groaned and struggled, Sophie's pencil flew across her paper, solving each problem with a quiet determination. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of pride. No matter what Mr. Thompson or her classmates thought of her, they couldn't take this away from her. But her moment of triumph was short-lived. "Ms. Lynn," Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the classroom like a knife, "since you seem so confident, why don't you come up and solve this problem for the class?" Sophie's heart pounded as she made her way to the front of the room. The equation on the board was far more advanced than anything they'd covered in class, but she refused to let her fear show. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the chalk and began to work through the problem step by step. The room fell silent save for the soft scratch of chalk against the board. As she wrote the final answer, Sophie allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. She turned to face the class, expecting to see surprise or perhaps even a grudging respect on their faces. Instead, she was met with sneers and muffled giggles. Mr. Thompson's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Wrong," he declared, erasing her work with a few quick swipes. "Perhaps you should spend less time daydreaming and more time studying, Ms. Lin. Take your seat." Humiliated, Sophie returned to her desk, fighting back tears. She knew her answer had been correct, but Mr. Thompson's word was law in this classroom. As she sank into her chair, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a dangerous thought. Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe she was destined to be nothing more than the newspaper girl forever. But then she felt the crinkle of paper in her pocket, her grandfather's note. With trembling fingers, she touched it, drawing strength from the love it represented. No, she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. Not when her grandfather sacrificed so much to give her this chance. As the lesson continued, Sophie straightened her shoulders and picked up her pencil once more. She may have lost this battle, but the war was far from over. Little did she know an unexpected ally was about to enter the fray, ready to change the course of her life forever. The following day dawned grey and drizzly, matching Sophie's mood as she trudged to school. The events of yesterday still weighed heavily on her mind, each step feeling like she was wading through molasses. As she entered the classroom, the usual whispers and giggles followed her, but today they seemed more intense, more pointed. Brittany's voice carried across the room, loud enough for Sophie to hear clearly. "I heard her grandfather can't even afford to buy her new shoes. How pathetic is that?" Sophie's cheeks burned as she glanced down at her worn sneakers, the soles starting to separate from the fabric. She tried to hide the damage with marker, but it was becoming increasingly obvious. Just as she was about to sink into her seat, Mr. Thompson's voice boomed through the room. "Attention, class. Today we have a special guest. Mr. James Chen, a successful businessman, is here to speak to you about overcoming adversity." Sophie's head snapped up as a tall, distinguished-looking man with salt-and-pepper hair entered the room. He wore a crisp suit that probably cost more than everything in Sophie's apartment combined. But it wasn't his clothes that caught her attention. It was the kind smile on his face as his eyes swept across the classroom. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Mr. Chen said, his voice warm and confident. "I'm excited to share my story with you all today." As Mr. Chen began to speak about his childhood in a poor immigrant family, Sophie found herself leaning forward, hanging on every word. Here was someone who understood what it was like to feel different, to struggle, to dream of something more. Suddenly, Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the room. "Before we continue, let's see if yesterday's lesson sank in. Ms. Lin, come solve this equation." Sophie's stomach dropped as she made her way to the board. The problem was even more complex than yesterday's, but she forced her trembling hand to remain steady as she worked through it step by step. As she wrote the final answer, she heard Mr. Thompson's dismissive snort. "Wrong again, Ms. Lin. I expected better from—" "Excuse me," Mr. Chen's voice interrupted, surprisingly firm, "but I believe the young lady's answer is correct." The room fell silent as Mr. Chen strode to the board, examining Sophie's work. "In fact," he continued, "her approach is quite innovative. I'm impressed." Mr. Thompson's face reddened. "Now see here, Mr. Chen, I appreciate your visit, but I am the teacher in this classroom." "And I," Mr. Chen replied coolly, "am a graduate of MIT with a PhD in applied mathematics. I can assure you, the student's work is impeccable." Sophie's heart raced as she looked between Mr. Chen and Mr. Thompson. No one had ever stood up for her like this before. Mr. Chen turned to Sophie, his eyes kind but intense. "What's your name, young lady?" Sophie Lin, sir," she managed to stammer. "Well, Sophie Lin," he said with a smile, "you have a remarkable mind. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Sophie returned to her seat, she felt as though she was floating. For the first time in years, someone other than her grandfather had seen her, really seen her. Mr. Chen continued his talk, but now his eyes frequently returned to Sophie, as if he'd recognized a kindred spirit. As the class ended and students began to file out, he approached her desk. "Sophie," he said quietly, "I'd like to speak with you and your guardian, if possible." I think you have incredible potential, and I'd like to discuss some opportunities that might be available to you." As Sophie nodded, barely able to believe what she was hearing, she failed to notice the dark look that passed over Mr. Thompson's face. The teacher's hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with barely suppressed anger. Little did Sophie know, but this moment of triumph was about to set in motion a chain of events that would test her in ways she never imagined. The battle for her future was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than she could possibly know. The next few days passed in a blur for Sophie. Mr. Chen's words of encouragement had planted a seed of hope in her heart, one that she nurtured carefully, afraid that it might wither under the harsh realities of her life. She hadn't told her grandfather about the encounter yet, fearful of raising his hopes only to have them dashed. On Friday afternoon, as Sophie helped her grandfather organize the day's unsold newspapers, she finally gathered the courage to speak. "Grandpa," she began hesitantly, "something happened at school this week. Something good." Edward Lynn looked up from his work, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Tell me, little one, what has brought that light to your eyes?" As Sophie recounted her interaction with Mr. Chen, her grandfather's eyes grew wide with wonder. When she finished, he enveloped her in a tight hug, his calloused hands gentle against her back. "My brave, brilliant girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I always knew you were destined for great things." Just then a sleek black car pulled up beside their small newspaper stand. The window rolled down, revealing Mr. Chen's friendly face. "Mr. Lin, Sophie," he called out. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I was hoping we could talk." Edward straightened up, smoothing down his worn shirt self-consciously. "Of course, Mr. Chen, we're honored." As they spoke, Sophie couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between Mr. Chen's polished appearance and her grandfather's threadbare clothes. Yet there was a warmth in Mr. Chen's eyes that made her feel at ease. "I've been thinking a lot about Sophie since our encounter," Mr. Chen explained. "Her talent is extraordinary, and I believe she deserves every opportunity to nurture it." He went on to outline a proposal that left both Sophie and her grandfather speechless. Mr. Chen offered to personally fund Sophie's education, including private tutoring and eventually, if she chose, university. "But why?" Sophie couldn't help but ask. "Why would you do this for me?" Mr. Chen's expression softened. "Because many years ago someone did the same for me. They saw potential in a poor immigrant boy and gave him a chance. Now, it's my turn to pay it forward." As the reality of this life-changing opportunity sank in, Sophie felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was everything she had ever dreamed of, but it also meant stepping into a world she knew nothing about. "There's just one condition," Mr. Chen added, his tone becoming serious. "Sophie must commit to working hard and always doing her best. This won't be easy, but I believe she's up for the challenge." "What do you say, Sophie?" Sophie looked at her grandfather, seeing the pride and hope shining in his eyes. She thought of all the sacrifices he had made for her, all the nights he had gone hungry so she could eat. This was her chance to make a better life for both of them. Taking a deep breath, Sophie met Mr. Chen's gaze. "I promise to work harder than I ever have before. I won't let you down." As Mr. Chen shook hands with both Sophie and her grandfather, sealing their agreement, none of them noticed the figure watching from across the street. Mr. Thompson stood in the shadows, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and determination. The teacher had overheard everything, and he was not about to let his authority be undermined by a precocious student and a meddling businessman. As he walked away, his mind was already formulating a plan to put Sophie in her place once and for all. Little did Sophie know, but her journey was about to become far more challenging than she could have ever imagined. The road ahead would test not only her intellect, but her character, resilience, and the very bonds of her relationships. The true battle for her future was just beginning. The following Monday, Sophie walked into Oakwood Elementary with her head held high, a newfound confidence buoying her steps. The promise of Mr. Chen's support had given her a glimmer of hope, a taste of a future she had only dared to dream about, in the quietest corners of her heart. As she entered the classroom, however, the familiar hush fell over the room, followed by the whispers and stares she had grown accustomed to. But today there was something different in the air, a tension that she couldn't quite place. Mr. Thompson stood at the front of the room, his eyes following Sophie as she made her way to her desk. The smile on his face sent a chill down her spine. It was the kind of smile a cat might give a cornered mouse. "Ah, Miss Lynn," he said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "So glad you could join us. I hope you're ready for today's pop quiz." Sophie's heart sank. They hadn't had a pop quiz in months, and the material they'd been covering recently had been far more advanced than usual. As Mr. Thompson handed out the papers, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow meant for her. Her suspicions were confirmed as soon as she looked at the questions. They were far beyond anything they'd studied in class, delving into concepts she'd only glimpsed in the advanced math books she sometimes borrowed from the library. Panic threatened to overwhelm her as she stared at the incomprehensible symbols and equations. This was her chance to prove herself, to show that Mr. Chen's faith in her wasn't misplaced. But as the minutes ticked by and her paper remained blank, Sophie felt her dreams slipping through her fingers. "Time's up," Mr. Thompson announced, much sooner than usual. As he collected the papers, his eyes lingered on Sophie's nearly empty sheet, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, class," he said, shuffling through the quizzes, "it seems some of us may have been overestimating our abilities. Ms. Lynn, would you care to explain your performance?" Sophie's face burned as all eyes turned to her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I thought not," Mr. Thompson continued. "Perhaps this will serve as a reminder that natural talent only goes so far. Hard work and respect for one's teachers are what truly matter." As the class ended and students filed out, Sophie remained rooted to her chair, fighting back tears. She had failed, not just herself, but Mr. Chen and her grandfather. How could she face them now? "Sophie?" A soft voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to see Emily, a quiet girl who sat near the front of the class, standing beside her desk. I just wanted to say," Emily stammered, her eyes darting nervously around the room, "that quiz was really hard. Like way harder than anything we've done before. I don't think anyone did well on it." Sophie blinked in surprise. Emily had never spoken to her before, always seeming to fade into the background of the classroom. "Thanks," Sophie managed to say, offering a small smile. "I thought it was just me." Emily shook her head. "No way. I overheard some of the other kids talking. Even Brittany was complaining about how impossible it was." As Emily hurried away, Sophie felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this. But the question remained, why had Mr. Thompson given such an impossible quiz? As she walked home that afternoon, her steps heavy with disappointment, Sophie wrestled with whether to tell her grandfather about the quiz. She hated the idea of causing him any more worry, but the thought of keeping secrets from him felt even worse. To her surprise, she found not only her grandfather waiting for her at their small apartment, but Mr. Chen as well. The two men were deep in conversation, but both looked up with warm smiles as Sophie entered. "There she is," her grandfather exclaimed, pulling her into a hug. "Mr. Chen was just telling me about the wonderful opportunities he has in mind for you." Sophie's heart clenched. How could she tell them about her failure now, when they both looked so hopeful? Mr. Chen must have noticed her hesitation. "Sophie," he said gently, "is everything all right? You seem troubled." Taking a deep breath, Sophie recounted the events of the day, the impossible quiz, Mr. Thompson's cutting remarks, and her own feelings of inadequacy. To her surprise, Mr. Chen's face darkened with concern. "Sophie," he said, his voice serious, "may I see this quiz?" When Sophie produced the crumpled paper from her backpack, Mr. Chen's frown deepened as he examined the questions. "This material," he said slowly, "is far beyond elementary school level. In fact, some of these concepts aren't typically introduced until high school or even early college courses." Sophie's grandfather gasped. But why would her teacher do such a thing? Mr. Chen's expression was grim. "I'm not sure, but I intend to find out. Sophie, I want you to know that this doesn't reflect on your abilities at all. You've done nothing wrong." As Mr. Chen prepared to leave, promising to look into the matter, Sophie felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was grateful that they believed her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of her troubles. That night, as she lay in bed, Sophie's mind raced with questions. Why was Mr. Thompson so determined to see her fail? What would Mr. Chen do? And most importantly, did she have the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead? Little did she know the answers to these questions would come sooner than she expected, and they would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about herself, her school, and the path to her dreams. The next morning, Sophie arrived at school to find an unusual buzz of activity. Students huddled in small groups, whispering excitedly, while teachers hurried through the halls with worried expressions. As Sophie made her way to her classroom, she overheard snippets of conversation that made her heart race. "Did you hear, Mr. Thompson's been called to the principal's office. I heard there's some big-shot businessman threatening to sue the school." Sophie slipped into her seat, her mind whirling. Could this have something to do with yesterday's quiz? With Mr. Chen's promise to look into the matter? The usual morning bell rang, but Mr. Thompson was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a stern-looking woman Sophie recognized as the school principal, Mrs. Alvarez, entered the room. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice firm but not unkind. "There's been a situation that requires Mr. Thompson's attention. I'll be overseeing your class for the time being." As Mrs. Alvarez began the day's lesson, Sophie couldn't help but notice the curious and sometimes accusatory glances thrown her way by her classmates. She sank lower in her seat, wishing she could disappear. At lunchtime, Sophie found a quiet corner of the playground to eat her meager lunch, a slightly squashed peanut butter sandwich and an apple that had seen better days. As she bit into the apple, a shadow fell across her. She looked up to see Brittany and her usual group of friends standing over her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "So," Brittany said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "word is, you're the reason Mr. Thompson's in trouble. Couldn't handle a little challenge, could you? Had to go crying to your rich new friend?" Sophie felt her cheeks burn. "I didn't do anything," she protested weakly. "The quiz was impossible. You said so yourself." Brittany's eyes narrowed. "Maybe for you. Some of us actually belong here, you know. We don't need charity cases bringing down the whole class." As Brittany and her friends sauntered away, their laughter echoing across the playground, Sophie felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She had never asked for any of this. All she wanted was a fair chance. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispers and sidelong glances. By the time the final bell rang, Sophie felt emotionally drained. As she trudged towards the school gates, a familiar voice called out to her, "Sophie, wait up!" She turned to see Emily jogging towards her, slightly out of breath. "I've been trying to catch you all day," Emily said, falling into step beside Sophie. "I wanted to make sure you were okay. Everyone's been talking, and I know a lot of it isn't true." Sophie managed a small smile. "Thanks, Emily. It's been a rough day." As they walked, Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You know, my mum used to be a teacher here. She left a few years ago, but she always said there was something not right about Mr. Thompson." Sophie's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Emily lowered her voice. "She never gave me details, but she said he had a history of targeting certain students, making their lives miserable, usually the ones who were different somehow, or who he saw as a threat." Sophie's mind raced. Could this be why Mr. Thompson had singled her out? Because she was poor? Because she was good at math? "Why didn't your mum report him?" Sophie asked. Emily shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "She tried, I think, but Mr. Thompson's been here forever. He has friends on the school board. Nothing ever came of it." As they reached the corner where they had to part ways, Emily gave Sophie a quick, awkward hug. "Don't let them get to you, okay? You're smarter than all of them put together." Watching Emily disappear down the street, Sophie felt a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude for Emily's kindness, anger at the injustice of Mr. Thompson's actions, and a growing determination to prove herself. But as she turned towards home, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Mr. Thompson might be in trouble now, but people like him didn't go down without a fight. And Sophie had the sinking feeling that she would be caught in the middle of whatever came next. Little did she know, the revelations of the day were just the tip of the iceberg. The coming weeks would test not only her academic abilities, but her resilience, her friendships, and her very sense of self. The battle for Sophie's future was about to enter a new, more challenging phase, one that would require every ounce of courage and determination she possessed. The following week brought a whirlwind of changes to Oakwood Elementary. Mr. Thompson remained conspicuously absent, with various substitute teachers rotating through the class. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of excitement and uncertainty, like the air before a thunderstorm. On Wednesday morning, Sophie arrived at school to find an unusual scene. A group of adults, including Mr. Chen, Mrs. Alvarez, and several people she didn't recognize, were gathered outside the main office, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. As Sophie tried to slip past unnoticed, Mr. Chen caught her eye and gave her a reassuring smile. She hurried to class, her mind buzzing with questions. The day's lessons had just begun when Mrs. Alvarez entered the room, her face grave. "Students," she announced, "I need to speak with Sophie Lin." "Sophie, please come with me." A chorus of oohs followed Sophie as she made her way to the front of the room, her legs feeling like jelly. What could this be about? To her surprise, Mrs. Alvarez led her not to the principal's office, but to a small conference room. Inside, she found Mr. Chen, her grandfather, and two people she didn't recognize. A kindly-looking woman with graying hair and a serious man in a crisp suit. "Sophie," Mrs. Alvarez said gently, "these people would like to ask you some questions about your experiences in Mr. Thompson's class. Is that all right?" Sophie nodded, her throat too dry to speak. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Martinez, an educational psychologist, while the man was Mr. Reeves, a lawyer representing the school district. Over the next hour, they asked Sophie detailed questions about her interactions with Mr. Thompson, the impossible quiz, and any other instances where she felt unfairly treated. As Sophie spoke, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time she was being heard, really heard, by people who had the power to make a difference. When the interview concluded, Dr. Martinez turned to the adults in the room. "Based on Sophie's account and the evidence we've gathered from other students and staff, I think it's clear that we're dealing with a serious case of academic discrimination and emotional abuse." Mr. Reeves nodded grimly. "I agree. The school district will need to take immediate action. Mr. Thompson's behavior is completely unacceptable." As the adults continued to discuss the situation, Sophie's grandfather pulled her into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, my brave girl," he whispered. "You've stood up not just for yourself, but for all the other children who might have suffered like you." Mr. Chen approached them, his face serious but kind. "Sophie, I want you to know that what you've done today is incredibly important. It takes great courage to speak truth to power, but I promise you, things are going to change for the better now." As Sophie left the conference room, she felt as though she was walking on air. For so long she had felt powerless in the face of Mr. Thompson's cruelty, but now, finally, she had found her voice. However, her elation was short-lived. As she re-entered the classroom, she was met with a sea of curious and sometimes hostile stares. Brittany, in particular, fixed her with a glare that could have melted steel. "Teacher's pet," Brittany hissed as Sophie passed her desk. "You think you're so special, don't you? Wait until everyone finds out what a snitch you are." Sophie's stomach churned, but she held her head high as she made her way to her seat. She knew she had done the right thing, no matter what her classmates might think. As the final bell rang and students began to file out, Sophie found her path blocked by a group of girls led by Brittany. "You know," Brittany said, her voice sickly sweet, "my daddy's on the school board. He says Mr. Thompson is a great teacher who's being railroaded by some crazy old man and his charity case." Sophie felt her face flush with anger. "Mr. Chen isn't crazy, and I'm not a charity case. Mr. Thompson was wrong, and you know it." Brittany's eyes narrowed. "Watch yourself, Lynn. You might think you've won, but trust me, this isn't over." As Brittany and her friends sauntered away, Sophie leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. She had thought that speaking up would solve everything, but now she realized that her troubles were far from over. Outside the school, she found Emily waiting for her. "I heard what happened," Emily said, falling into step beside Sophie. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. My mom would be proud of you." Sophie managed a small smile. "Thanks, Emily. I just hope it makes a difference." As they walked home together, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice. She had taken a stand, but the consequences of that action were still unfolding. The coming days would test her in ways she had never imagined, forcing her to confront not just external challenges, but her own fears and insecurities as well. Little did Sophie know, but the events of this day had set in motion a chain reaction that would not only change her life but the lives of everyone at Oakwood Elementary. The battle for justice and equality in education was just beginning, and Sophie Lynn, the quiet newspaper girl, was about to find herself at the very center of the storm. The following weeks at Oakwood Elementary were a whirlwind of change and uncertainty. Mr. Thompson's absence had become permanent, his name whispered in hushed tones in the hallways. Her series of substitute teachers cycled through the classroom, each bringing their own style and expectations. For Sophie, this period was a mixed blessing. On one hand, she no longer had to face Mr. Thompson's daily torment. On the other, she found herself the subject of intense scrutiny from both students and staff. Some of her classmates, led by Brittany, treated her with open hostility, blaming her for the disruption of their familiar routine. Others, like Emily, stood by her side, impressed by her courage in speaking up. One particularly tense afternoon, Sophie found herself cornered by Brittany and her friends near the school library. "You think you're so special now, don't you?" Brittany sneered. "Just wait. My dad says this whole thing is going to blow over and then you'll be sorry." Sophie felt her heart racing, but she stood her ground. "I didn't do anything wrong, Brittany. Mr. Thompson was the one who—" "Oh, save it," Brittany interrupted. "We all know you're just jealous because some of us actually have money and don't need handouts." Just as Sophie thought the situation might escalate, a firm voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, ladies?" They turned to see Mrs. Alvarez standing in the doorway of the library, her eyes sharp and assessing. "No, Mrs. Alvarez," Brittany said sweetly, her demeanor changing instantly. "We were just talking." As the group dispersed, Mrs. Alvarez placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Are you all right, Sophie? You know you can always come to me if you're having trouble with your classmates." Sophie nodded, grateful for the support but unsure how much to reveal. She didn't want to be seen as a tattletale, but the pressure was becoming overwhelming. That evening, as Sophie helped her grandfather sort through the day's unsold newspapers, she finally broke down and told him everything: the whispers, the glares, Brittany's threats. Edward Lynn listened patiently, his weathered face creased with concern. When Sophie finished, he enveloped her in a warm hug. "My brave, strong girl," he said softly, "you've taken on a great burden, standing up for what's right. But remember, you're not alone in this fight." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. To Sophie's surprise, Mr. Chen entered, his face serious but kind. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, taking in the scene. "I wanted to check in on Sophie and share some news." Over cups of steaming tea, Mr. Chen explained that the school board was conducting a full investigation into Mr. Thompson's behavior and the overall culture at Oakwood Elementary. "Your courage, Sophie," Mr. Chen said, his eyes shining with pride, "has opened the floodgates. Other students and even some teachers have come forward with their own stories. You've started something important here." Sophie felt a mix of pride and trepidation. "But what about Brittany and the others who are angry with me?" Mr. Chen's expression softened. "Change is never easy, Sophie. There will always be those who resist it. But I promise you, in time, they'll see that this is for the best for all of you." As Mr. Chen prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Oh, and Sophie? I've arranged for a special tutor to work with you after school. Her name is Ms. Rossi, and I think you'll find her methods quite different from what you're used to." That night, as Sophie lay in bed, her mind raced with thoughts of what the coming days might bring. The world she had known was shifting beneath her feet, and while it was terrifying, there was also a glimmer of excitement. For the first time in her life, Sophie felt like she had the power to make a real difference. As she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but wonder what other changes her actions might bring, not just for herself, but for all the students at Oakwood Elementary. The following Monday, Sophie arrived at school to find a palpable shift in the atmosphere. A new energy seemed to pulse through the hallways, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty that set her nerves on edge. As she entered the classroom, she was greeted by an unfamiliar face, a young woman with warm brown eyes and a bright smile. "Good morning, class," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight Italian accent. "I'm Ms. Rossi, and I'll be your new permanent teacher." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she realized this must be the tutor Mr. Chen had mentioned. Ms. Rossi's teaching style was unlike anything Sophie had experienced before. She encouraged questions, promoted discussion, and seemed genuinely interested in each student's perspective. For the first time, Sophie felt truly engaged in her lessons. her mind sparking with new ideas and connections. During their first one-on-one session after school, Ms. Rossi's eyes lit up as Sophie worked through a series of challenging math problems. "Sophie," she said, her voice filled with excitement, "your mind works in fascinating ways. You have a gift for seeing patterns that others might miss. We're going to nurture that talent." As the weeks passed, Sophie found herself blossoming under Ms. Rossi's guidance. Her confidence grew, not just in math, but in all her subjects. She began to raise her hand in class, to share her ideas without fear of ridicule. This change didn't go unnoticed by her classmates. While Brittany and her inner circle continued to treat Sophie with cold disdain, others began to seek her out for help with their studies. One afternoon, as Sophie was explaining a particularly tricky math concept to a small group of classmates, she caught sight of Brittany watching from across the room. To her surprise, instead of the usual glare, Brittany's expression was one of grudging curiosity. Meanwhile, the investigation into Mr. Thompson and the school's practices continued. Sophie was called in for several more interviews, each one leaving her feeling drained but oddly empowered. She was making a difference, she realized. Her voice mattered. At home, Sophie's grandfather beamed with pride at her progress reports. "You see," he would say, his eyes misty, "I always knew you were destined for great things." Mr. Chen, true to his word, remained a constant presence in Sophie's life. He visited regularly, always eager to hear about her latest achievements and to offer words of encouragement. One evening, as they sat in the small living room of Sophie's apartment, Mr. Chen's expression grew serious. "Sophie," he said, "I want to talk to you about your future. You're progressing faster than anyone could have anticipated. I think it's time we consider some more advanced options for your education." Sophie's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Mr. Chen smiled. "There's a prestigious private school, Westfield Academy, that offers an accelerated program for gifted students. I think you'd thrive there." Sophie's mind whirled with possibilities. A new school, new opportunities, but also new challenges. Could she really leave Oakwood behind? What about her grandfather, her budding friendships with Emily and the others? As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Chen added gently, "It's just an option to consider, Sophie. Whatever you decide, we'll support you, but I want you to know that the world is opening up for you. Your potential is limitless." That night, Sophie lay awake for hours, her thoughts a tumultuous mix of excitement and anxiety. She had come so far from the shy, downtrodden newspaper girl she had been just months ago, but was she ready for such a big leap? As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something monumental. The choices she made in the coming days would shape not just her future, but potentially the futures of countless other students like her. Little did she know, but the greatest challenges and the most profound revelations were yet to come. The journey that had begun with a cruel teacher and an impossible quiz was about to take Sophie to places she had never dreamed possible, testing her in ways that would reveal the true depths of her character and her potential. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity for Sophie. Between her regular classes, advanced sessions with Ms. Rossi, and the ongoing investigation into Oakwood's practices, she barely had a moment to catch her breath. One crisp autumn morning, Sophie arrived at school to find an unusual buzz of excitement. A colorful banner hung in the main hallway, announcing an upcoming district-wide math competition. "Attention, students," Mrs. Alvarez's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're looking for participants to represent Oakwood in the competition. Any interested students should see their math teachers for details." Sophie's heart raced. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed of. But as she made her way to Ms. Rossi's classroom, doubt began to creep in. Could she really compete against the best students in the district? Ms. Rossi's face lit up when Sophie tentatively expressed her interest. "Sophie, this is perfect for you. Your problem-solving skills are exceptional. With some focused preparation, I think you could do very well." As word spread that Sophie was considering entering the competition, she found herself the center of attention once again. But this time, the whispers in the hallway had a different tone. "Did you hear? Sophie Lynn might represent us in the math competition. I heard she can solve college-level problems." Even Brittany seemed to be watching Sophie with a new, calculating look in her eyes. That afternoon, as Sophie was gathering her things to leave, Brittany approached her desk. "So," Brittany said, her voice carefully neutral, "you're really going to enter the competition?" Sophie nodded, bracing herself for a cutting remark. But to her surprise, Brittany's next words caught her completely off guard. "I'm entering too," Brittany said, a hint of challenge in her voice. "May the best mathematician win." As Brittany walked away, Sophie felt a complex mix of emotions. There was the familiar anxiety that Brittany's presence always brought, but also a new feeling, a spark of competitive fire that she had never experienced before. At home, Sophie shared the news about the competition with her grandfather. Edward Lynn's eyes filled with proud tears as he hugged her tightly. "My brilliant girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're going to shine so bright." Later that evening, Mr. Chen stopped by for one of his regular visits. When Sophie told him about the competition, his face broke into a wide grin. "This is wonderful news, Sophie. In fact, it ties in perfectly with what I wanted to discuss with you." Mr. Chen explained that he had spoken with the administration at Westfield Academy. They were very interested in Sophie's potential and were willing to offer her a full scholarship, but they wanted to see her performance in a competitive setting first. "The math competition would be the perfect opportunity," Mr. Chen said. "If you do well, it could open doors you never imagined possible." Sophie's mind reeled. The stakes had suddenly become much higher. This wasn't just about proving herself at Oakwood anymore. It could be her ticket to a whole new world of opportunities. But as she lay in bed that night, doubt began to gnaw at her. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she froze up during the competition? And even if she did well, was she really ready to leave Oakwood? To leave behind her grandfather and the life she knew? The next few weeks were a blur of intense preparation. Sophie spent every spare moment studying, practicing problem-solving techniques with Ms. Rossi, and running through sample questions provided by Mr. Chen. As the day of the competition drew near, Sophie felt the pressure mounting. She knew that her performance could determine not just her standing at Oakwood, but potentially the entire course of her future. The morning of the competition dawned bright and clear. As Sophie stood outside the large auditorium where the event would be held, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Emily, her eyes shining with support. "You've got this, Sophie," Emily said firmly. "No matter what happens in there, you've already proven how amazing you are." With a deep breath, Sophie squared her shoulders and walked into the auditorium. As she took her seat, she caught sight of Brittany across the room, looking uncharacteristically nervous. As the proctor began to hand out the test papers, Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. In her mind, she saw her grandfather's proud smile, felt Miss Rossi's encouraging words, and remembered Mr. Chen's unwavering belief in her potential. Opening her eyes, Sophie picked up her pencil. Whatever the outcome, she was ready to give it her all. As she looked down at the first question, a sense of calm washed over her. This was her moment to shine. Little did Sophie know, but her performance in this competition would set in motion a series of events that would not only change her life, but would have far-reaching consequences for Oakwood Elementary, Westfield Academy, and the entire school district. The true test of Sophie's character and abilities was about to begin. The hush that fell over the auditorium was almost palpable as the math competition began. Sophie's pencil flew across the paper, her mind working at a fever pitch as she tackled problem after problem. The questions were challenging, pushing the limits of her knowledge and problem-solving skills. But Sophie found herself rising to meet each new challenge with a mix of determination and exhilaration. As the minutes ticked by, Sophie became aware of a growing buzz of frustration around her. Many of her fellow competitors were struggling, some even on the verge of tears. But Sophie remained focused, drawing on all the skills she had honed under Ms. Rossi's guidance. When the proctor finally called time, Sophie set down her pencil with a mix of relief and regret. She had given it her all, but had it been enough? As they filed out of the auditorium, Sophie caught sight of Brittany. To her surprise, the usually confident girl looked shaken, her face pale and drawn. "That was intense," Brittany said, her voice lacking its usual edge. "I've never seen anything like those last few problems." Sophie nodded, feeling a surprising surge of empathy for her longtime rival. "They were tough," she agreed. "But we did our best, right?" Brittany gave her a long, appraising look before nodding slowly. "Yeah, I guess we did." The wait for the results was agonizing. Sophie threw herself into her studies, trying to distract herself from the constant wondering. Her grandfather and Mr. Chen both assured her that they were proud of her regardless of the outcome, but Sophie couldn't help feeling that her entire future hung in the balance. Finally, 2 weeks after the competition, Mrs. Alvarez called Sophie to her office. Sophie's heart pounded as she made her way through the familiar hallways, her mind racing with possibilities. As she entered the office, Sophie was surprised to see not only Mrs. Alvarez but also Mr. Chen, Ms. Rossi, and a woman she didn't recognize, an elegant, silver-haired lady in a crisp suit. Mrs. Alvarez's face broke into a wide smile. "Sophie," she said, her voice warm with pride, "I have some extraordinary news. You didn't just do well in the competition, you had the highest score in the entire district." Sophie's knees went weak. She had hoped to do well, but this was beyond her wildest dreams. Mr. Chen stepped forward, his eyes shining. "Sophie, I'd like you to meet Dr. Eleanor Winters, the headmistress of Westfield Academy." Dr. Winters extended her hand, her grip firm and confident. "Ms. Lin," she said, her voice crisp but kind, "your performance was truly exceptional. We would be honored to have you join us at Westfield, starting next semester if you're willing." Sophie's mind whirled. It was happening so fast. Everything she had worked for, dreamed of, was suddenly within reach. But as she opened her mouth to accept, a sudden thought stopped her cold. "What about the other students at Oakwood?" she asked, surprising even herself. "What about all the kids who don't have the same opportunities I've had?" A heavy silence fell over the room. It was Mr. Chen who finally broke it, his voice gentle but firm. "Sophie," he said, "your concern for others does you credit, but you can't solve all the world's problems at once. Sometimes the best way to help others is to make the most of your own opportunities." Sophie bit her lip, torn between her dreams and her sense of responsibility to her classmates. It was Ms. Rossi who finally tipped the balance. "Sophie," she said softly, "think of all you've accomplished here at Oakwood. You've already changed things for the better. Maybe at Westfield you can learn how to make even bigger changes." As Sophie looked around the room at the faces of those who had supported her, guided her, believed in her, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't an ending, she realized. It was a beginning. "I'll do it," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I'll go to Westfield, but I want to find a way to help other students like me, to make sure they get the same chances I've had." Dr. Winters nodded approvingly. "I think we can work something out," she said. "In fact, I have a few ideas already." As Sophie left the office, her head spinning with plans and possibilities, she nearly collided with Brittany in the hallway. For a moment, the two girls stared at each other, years of rivalry and misunderstanding hanging between them. Then, to Sophie's shock, Brittany held out her hand. "Congratulations," she said, her voice sincere if a bit strained. "You earned it." As Sophie shook Brittany's hand, she felt as though a weight she hadn't even known she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. She had faced her challenges, proven herself, and even begun to bridge the gaps that had seemed so insurmountable. But as she walked home that afternoon, Sophie knew that her journey was far from over. New challenges, new responsibilities awaited her at Westfield. The girl who had started the year as the overlooked newspaper girl was now stepping into a role she had never imagined for herself. A leader, an example, a force for change. As she rounded the corner and saw her grandfather waiting for her, his face beaming with pride, Sophie felt a surge of gratitude for everyone who had believed in her, supported her, pushed her to be her best self. The future stretched out before her, full of promise and possibility. And Sophie Lin was ready to meet it head-on. The last few weeks of Sophie's time at Oakwood Elementary were a whirlwind of activity. News of her achievement in the math competition and her impending transfer to Westfield Academy spread quickly, transforming her standing in the school almost overnight. Students who had once ignored or mocked her now sought her out for advice and help with their studies. Teachers who had barely noticed her before now spoke of her as an example of what hard work and determination could achieve. Even Brittany and her friends, while not exactly friendly, treated Sophie with a newfound respect. But for Sophie, these final days at Oakwood were bittersweet. As excited as she was about the opportunities awaiting her at Westfield, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness at leaving behind the familiar halls and faces of the school that had been her world for so long. One afternoon, as Sophie was tutoring a group of younger students in the library, she was surprised to see Brittany lingering nearby, an uncharacteristically hesitant expression on her face. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Brittany asked, her voice low. Curious, Sophie nodded and followed Brittany to a quiet corner. I wanted to apologize," Brittany said, the words seeming to cost her great effort. "For how I treated you, it wasn't right." Sophie blinked in surprise. Of all the changes she had experienced in recent weeks, this was perhaps the most unexpected. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." Brittany nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "I also wanted to ask, do you think you could help me? With math, I mean. I've been struggling, and after seeing how you did in the competition..." Sophie felt a warm glow of satisfaction. Here was a chance to turn years of rivalry into something positive. "Of course," she said with a smile. "I'd be happy to help." As word spread that Sophie was tutoring Brittany, other students began to approach her as well. Before long, Sophie found herself at the center of an impromptu study group, sharing the techniques and insights she had gained from Ms. Rossi and her own hard work. Watching Sophie work with her classmates, Ms. Rossi couldn't help but smile. She pulled Sophie aside one afternoon, her eyes shining with pride. "You know, Sophie," she said, "you have a real gift for teaching. Have you ever considered it as a career?" Sophie hadn't, but the idea took root in her mind, blossoming with possibilities. She thought of all the students like her, who might benefit from a teacher who truly understood their struggles and potential. "I'll definitely think about it," Sophie replied, a new spark of excitement in her eyes. As her last day at Oakwood approached, Sophie found herself filled with a mix of emotions. Excitement for the future, gratitude for the opportunities she'd been given, and a deep sense of responsibility to use her success to help others. On her final morning, Sophie arrived at school to find a surprise waiting for her. The hallway was lined with students and teachers, all applauding as she walked in. At the end of the corridor stood her grandfather, Mr. Chen, and Ms. Rossi, their faces beaming with pride. Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward, holding a small plaque. "Sophie Lin," she announced, her voice ringing through the hall, "in recognition of your outstanding academic achievement and your dedication to helping your fellow students, we present you with Oakwood's first-ever Spirit of Excellence Award." As Sophie accepted the plaque, her eyes brimming with tears, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Emily smiling through her own tears. "You did it, Sophie," Emily said softly. "You changed things here, for all of us." Looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some she was only now getting to know, Sophie felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had supported her, believed in her, and given her a chance to shine. With a deep breath, Sophie stepped forward to address her classmates and teachers. "Thank you all so much," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "When I started this year, I never imagined I'd be standing here like this. I was just trying to survive, to not let the hard times beat me down." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But what I've learned is that we're all capable of so much more than we think. And we're strongest when we support each other, when we lift each other up instead of tearing each other down." Sophie's eyes found Brittany in the crowd, and she offered a small smile. "I'm going to Westfield Academy, and I'm excited for that opportunity. But I promise I won't forget where I came from. I'm going to do everything I can to create opportunities for others, to make sure every student has the chance to reach their full potential." As Sophie finished speaking, the hallway erupted in cheers and applause. She found herself surrounded by well-wishers, each eager to share a word of congratulations or thanks. Later that afternoon, as Sophie prepared to leave Oakwood for the last time, she paused in the doorway of her classroom. So much had changed in such a short time. The girl who had entered this room months ago, head down and spirit nearly broken, was not the same one who stood there now. Ms. Rossi appeared beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've come so far, Sophie," she said softly, "but this is just the beginning. Remember, no matter where you go or what you achieve, you'll always have a home here at Oakwood." With a final look around the classroom that had been the scene of so many challenges and triumphs, Sophie stepped into the hallway, ready to face whatever new adventures awaited her. As she walked out of Oakwood's doors, Sophie knew that she was leaving behind more than just a school. She was leaving behind the doubts and fears that had once held her back, but she was taking with her the strength, wisdom, and determination she had gained through her experiences. The future stretched out before her, full of promise and possibility, and Sophie Lynn was ready to embrace it, armed with the knowledge that she had the power to shape not just her own destiny, but to make a difference in the lives of others as well. The first day at Westfield Academy dawned bright and clear, a perfect metaphor for the new chapter in Sophie's life. As she stood at the imposing gates of the school, her neatly pressed uniform a stark contrast to the worn clothes she had once worn at Oakwood, Sophie felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. Her grandfather squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You've got this, my brave girl," he said, his eyes shining with pride. "Show them what Sophie Lynn is made of." With a deep breath, Sophie stepped through the gates and into her new world. The campus was a far cry from Oakwood's modest buildings. Manicured lawns stretched between stately brick structures, and students hurried along cobblestone paths, their voices a mix of languages and accents from around the world. As Sophie made her way to the main office, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of insecurity. These students came from wealthy, influential families. Would they accept her? Would she be able to keep up with their advanced curriculum? But as she entered her first class, Advanced Mathematics with Dr. Archer, Sophie felt her doubts begin to melt away. The problems on the board were challenging, yes, but not insurmountable. As Dr. Archer began to explain a complex theorem, Sophie found herself raising her hand, offering insights that made even the teacher pause in appreciation. "Excellent observation, Ms. Lynn," Dr. Archer said, a note of surprise in his voice. "It seems Westfield has gained quite the mathematical mind." As the days passed, Sophie found herself settling into a new rhythm. The work was demanding, pushing her to expand her knowledge and skills in ways she had never imagined. But with each challenge she overcame, her confidence grew. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were still those who looked down on her because of her background, who whispered about the scholarship girl, when they thought she couldn't hear. But Sophie refused to let their words define her. Instead, she threw herself into her studies with renewed determination, proving through her actions that she belonged at Westfield just as much as anyone else. One afternoon, as Sophie was working on a particularly challenging project in the library, she overheard a group of students discussing a volunteer tutoring program at a nearby public school. Her ears perked up, remembering her promise to use her opportunities to help others. Without hesitation, Sophie approached the group. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I couldn't help overhearing. Is there any way I could get involved in the tutoring program?" The students looked at her with surprise, but it was a friendly-faced girl named Zara who spoke up. "Of course. We're always looking for more tutors, especially in math and sciences. Have you had any experience tutoring before?" Sophie smiled, thinking of her impromptu study groups at Oakwood. "I have, actually, and I'd love to help out if I can." From that moment, Sophie's world expanded even further. Twice a week she would travel to Lincoln Middle School, working with students who reminded her so much of herself just a year ago. She saw in their eyes the same hunger for knowledge, the same determination to rise above their circumstances that had driven her. As weeks turned into months, Sophie found herself thriving not just academically but socially as well. Her genuine kindness and willingness to help others gradually won over even the most skeptical of her classmates. She formed close friendships with Zara and a small group of other students who shared her passion for learning and making a difference. One evening, as Sophie was packing up after a tutoring session at Lincoln, she was surprised to see Dr. Winters, the headmistress of Westfield, waiting for her. "I hope you don't mind, Sophie," Dr. Winters said with a warm smile. "I wanted to see for myself the impact you've been making here." As they walked together, Dr. Winters shared the feedback she'd received from Lincoln's teachers and administrators. Sophie's work had not gone unnoticed. Test scores were improving, attendance was up, and students who had once been on the verge of dropping out were now talking about college. "You're doing remarkable work, Sophie," Dr. Winters said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "You're not just excelling in your own studies, you're lifting others up along with you. That's the true mark of a leader." Sophie felt a warmth spread through her chest at Dr. Winters' words. For so long she had been focused on proving that she belonged at Westfield, but now she realized that she had the power to do so much more, to be a bridge between two worlds, to open doors for others the way Mr. Chen and Ms. Rossi had done for her. As they reached the school gates, Dr. Winters turned to Sophie with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Sophie, we've been discussing ways to expand our outreach programs to make Westfield's resources more accessible to promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds. I think your perspective would be invaluable in shaping these initiatives. Would you be interested in being part of the planning committee?" Sophie's eyes widened. This was an opportunity to make a real, lasting difference, to potentially change the lives of countless students like herself. "I'd be honored," she said, her voice filled with determination. As she headed home that evening, Sophie's mind was buzzing with ideas. She thought of her journey from the shy, downtrodden newspaper girl to where she stood now, a top student at a prestigious academy, a mentor to others, and now, potentially, a voice for change at an institutional level. But amidst all the excitement, Sophie never forgot the people and experiences that had shaped her. She still visited Oakwood regularly, sharing her experiences with the students there and encouraging them to dream big. She kept in touch with Ms. Rossi, seeking her advice and sharing her successes. And every night, she sat with her grandfather, helping him with his English studies just as he had once helped her with her math. As Sophie drifted off to sleep that night, she felt a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. She had been given an incredible opportunity, yes, but she was determined to use that opportunity to open doors for others. The future stretched out before her, full of challenges and possibilities, and Sophie Lynn was ready to meet it head-on, armed with knowledge, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the power of education to transform lives. 5 years had passed since Sophie first stepped through the gates of Westfield Academy. Now on a warm spring morning, she found herself standing once again in front of Oakwood Elementary, her heart full of memories and anticipation. The years at Westfield had been transformative. Sophie had not only excelled academically, graduating as valedictorian, but she had also become a driving force behind the school's expanded outreach programs. The initiative she had helped develop with Dr. Winters had grown into a comprehensive scholarship and mentoring program, providing opportunities for dozens of promising students from underprivileged backgrounds. But today wasn't about Westfield or her achievements there. Today, Sophie was giving back to the place where her journey had begun. As she walked through Oakwood's familiar halls, now bright with fresh paint and new educational posters, Sophie couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed and how much remained the same. The faces were different, but the mix of hope, anxiety, and determination in the students' eyes was all too familiar. Sophie made her way to the auditorium, where the entire school had gathered for a special assembly. As she stepped onto the stage, she saw a sea of young faces looking up at her with curiosity and excitement. In the front row sat her grandfather, Mr. Chen, and Ms. Rossi, their faces beaming with pride. Taking a deep breath, Sophie began to speak. 5 years ago, I stood in this very auditorium, feeling small and insignificant. I was the newspaper girl, the one who never quite fit in. I never imagined that I would be standing here today, about to start my freshman year at MIT with the chance to speak to all of you. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. But my story isn't just about me. It's about every single one of you. It's about the power of education, of perseverance, and most importantly of believing in yourself even when others don't. As Sophie shared her journey, the challenges she had faced, the people who had believed in her, and the opportunities she had seized, she saw a change come over the students. Backs straightened, eyes brightened, and a palpable sense of possibility filled the air. I'm here today not just to share my story, Sophie continued, her voice strong and clear, but to announce a new partnership between Oakwood Elementary and Westfield Academy. Starting this year, Westfield will be providing resources for advanced math and science programs here at Oakwood. And for those of you who dream of following a similar path to mine, we're establishing a full scholarship program to help Oakwood's brightest students attend Westfield. A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Sophie saw hope dawning on faces that had perhaps never dared to dream so big before. But remember, Sophie said, her voice softening, a scholarship or a fancy school isn't what defines you. What defines you is your determination, your kindness, and your willingness to lift others up as you climb. Every single one of you has the potential to change the world in ways big and small. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. As Sophie concluded her speech, The auditorium erupted in applause. Students surged forward, eager to ask questions and share their own dreams. In their eyes, Sophie saw reflections of her younger self and the promise of even brighter futures. Later that afternoon, as Sophie walked through the neighborhood with her grandfather, she felt a profound sense of coming full circle. The streets that had once seemed to constrain her now felt like a launching pad for endless possibilities. "I'm so proud of you, my Sophie," her grandfather said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've become more than I ever dreamed possible." Sophie squeezed his hand. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandpa. Your love and support gave me the strength to keep going, even when things were tough." As they rounded the corner, Sophie was surprised to see a familiar face. Brittany, her old rival from Oakwood. The years had softened the edges of their relationship, transforming childhood animosity into a cautious mutual respect. "Sophie," Brittany called out, a genuine smile on her face, "I heard you were back in town. Congratulations on MIT. That's incredible." "Thanks, Brittany," Sophie replied warmly. "How have you been?" As they chatted, Sophie learned that Brittany had found her own path, excelling in business studies and preparing to join her family's company. But there was a newfound humility in Brittany's demeanor, a recognition that success could take many forms. "You know," Brittany said, her voice thoughtful, "watching you succeed, seeing how you've used your opportunities to help others, it's inspired me. I've been talking with my parents about setting up a scholarship fund for Oakwood students. I thought maybe you'd like to be involved." Sophie felt a warmth spread through her chest. This, she realized, was the true measure of her journey, not just her own success, but the ripple effect it had created, inspiring others to create positive change. "I'd be honored," Sophie said, her smile bright. "Let's work together to make it happen." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Sophie felt a profound sense of peace and purpose. Her journey had taken her far from these streets, but it had also led her back, equipped with the knowledge, resources, and determination to make a lasting difference. Sophie Lynn, once the overlooked newspaper girl, had become a beacon of hope and possibility, and as she looked towards the future, to MIT, to the challenges and opportunities that awaited her, she knew that this was just the beginning. There were more lives to touch, more barriers to break, more dreams to nurture. With her grandfather by her side and the support of her community behind her, Sophie was ready to embrace the next chapter of her life. She carried with her the lessons of her past, the achievements of her present, and the limitless potential of her future. As they walked home, the streets of her childhood now a bridge to a world of possibilities, Sophie knew one thing with absolute certainty. The power to change lives, her own and others, had been within her all along. And armed with that knowledge, there was no limit to the good she could do in the world.